Have you ever wondered why some families seem to carry invisible burdens across generations? Why children of war survivors often struggle with anxiety, even though they never experienced the war themselves? Or why the grandchildren of famine victims might have different metabolic rates than their peers? Here's something that might blow your mind. The trauma your grandmother experienced, maybe she survived a famine, lived through a war, or endured severe stress, didn't just affect her. It literally changed the way her genes work. And here's the kicker. Those changes got passed down to your parent and then to you. Wait, I know what you're thinking. We learned in school that you can't inherit acquired characteristics, right? If your dad builds huge muscles at the gym, you won't be born with biceps. That's still true for the DNA sequence itself. But there's another layer to this story that scientists have only recently begun to understand. It's called epigenetics, and it's rewriting everything we thought we knew about inheritance. What epigenetics actually means. Let me explain this in a way that makes sense. Think of your DNA like a massive recipe book. Every cell in your body has the same book, but not every cell needs to make every recipe. Your liver cells don't need the instructions for making stomach acid. Your brain cells don't need to know how to produce insulin. So how do cells know which recipes to use? That's where epigenetics comes in. It's like having sticky notes all over your recipe book. Some pages are bookmarked as, use this often. Others are sealed shut with a paperclip saying don't open. These markers don't change the recipes themselves. The instructions stay exactly the same, but they completely change which recipes get made. The most common type of these sticky notes is something called DNA methylation. Basically, tiny chemical tags attach to your DNA and switch genes on or off. When scientists first discovered this, they assumed these tags would reset with each generation. New baby, fresh start, right? Wrong. Actually, I should clarify something here. Most of these tags do get wiped clean. When sperm meets egg, there's a massive reset that happens. But, and this is huge, some of these markers slip through. They survive the reset. And that means the experiences of your ancestors can literally affect which of your genes are turned on or off. The Dutch hunger winter, a natural experiment. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from a terrible tragedy. During World War II, the Nazis blocked food supplies to the Netherlands. For 6 brutal months, from November 1944 to May 1945, 4.4 million Dutch people survived on fewer than 1,000 calories a day. Some days, people got as little as 500 calories. Just try to imagine that. It's less than a quarter of what you probably eat. The famine ended when Allied forces liberated the country. But here's where it gets interesting from a scientific perspective. Researchers had precise records of who was pregnant during the famine, when they gave birth, and where they lived. This created what scientists grimly call a natural experiment. The babies born during and after the famine were smaller, which makes sense. But then researchers discovered something nobody expected. These children, when they grew up and had their own kids, those kids were also smaller. The effect lasted 2 generations. How is that even possible if DNA doesn't change? But wait, it gets weirder. Scientists recently studied the DNA of people who were in the womb during the Dutch hunger winter. They're now in their 70s. And guess what? They found specific patterns of DNA methylation that were different from their siblings who weren't exposed to the famine. 6 decades later, the molecular scars were still there. One gene particularly stood out, IGF-2, which controls growth. People exposed to famine in the womb had less methylation on this gene compared to their unexposed siblings. This wasn't just a random change. The timing mattered incredibly. Only babies who were in the very early stages of development during the famine showed this pattern. I remember reading about one woman whose mother was pregnant during the famine. She said she'd always wondered why she struggled with her weight and blood sugar, despite living a healthy lifestyle. When she learned about the epigenetic effects, she said it was like finally finding a missing puzzle piece. Not an excuse, but an explanation. The Holocaust studies trauma across generations. The Dutch famine gave us insights into nutritional stress. But what about psychological trauma? For this, researchers turned to another group with well-documented historical trauma: Holocaust survivors and their children. Now, everyone knew that children of Holocaust survivors often struggled with anxiety and depression. For years, people assumed this was purely psychological. Growing up with traumatized parents affects you, obviously. But researchers at Mount Sinai Hospital decided to look deeper. They wanted to know, could there be a biological component? They focused on a gene called FKBP5. This gene helps regulate how we respond to stress. When it's working normally, it helps your body calm down after a stressful event. When it's not, you stay revved up, anxious, on edge. The results were striking. Holocaust survivors showed increased methylation on this gene, about 10% more than the control group. But here's the really fascinating part. Their children, who were born after the war, showed decreased methylation on the exact same spot, about 7.7% less than control children. Same gene, same location, opposite changes. This blew researchers' minds. If children were just inheriting their parents' trauma directly, you'd expect the same changes, right? But the opposite pattern suggests something more complex is happening. The children's biology wasn't just copying the parents' trauma. It was responding to it, adapting to it. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who led the study, put it this way: the gene changes in the children could only be attributed to Holocaust exposure in the parents. Think about that for a second. An experience that happened before you were even conceived could affect how your genes are regulated. And not in some vague, theoretical way. In a measurable, specific change to your DNA methylation patterns. How does this even work? Okay, so trauma can change gene expression, and these changes can be inherited. But how? This is where things get really interesting. Scientists have identified 3 main routes for this inheritance, and honestly, they're all kind of mind-blowing. First, there's the prenatal route. When a pregnant woman experiences severe stress or malnutrition, it doesn't just affect her. The developing baby is bathed in stress hormones. The placenta, which is supposed to be a protective barrier, can't block everything. These exposures during critical developmental windows can set methylation patterns that last a lifetime. But that doesn't explain how fathers pass on trauma, does it? This brings us to the second route: changes in sperm. Yeah, you read that right. Sperm carry more than just DNA. They also carry small RNA molecules. Think of them as tiny instruction manuals that can affect how genes are read in the early embryo. Recent studies have shown that when men experience trauma, especially in childhood, it changes the RNA profile in their sperm. In one study, researchers found that men who experienced high levels of childhood trauma had different small RNA patterns in their sperm compared to men who hadn't experienced trauma. These differences persisted even after researchers controlled for lifestyle factors like smoking and drinking. The trauma had left a molecular signature in their sperm. And since sperm are produced throughout a man's adult life, experiences even shortly before conception could theoretically affect offspring. The third route involves the egg cells, though this is less studied because, well, getting human egg cells for research is a lot harder than getting sperm. But we know that women are born with all their eggs, and these eggs can accumulate epigenetic changes over time. The mouse studies that changed everything. I know what some of you might be thinking. These human studies are correlational. Maybe there are other explanations. How can we really know that epigenetic changes are inherited? Enter the mice. In 2014, researchers at Emory University did something remarkable. They trained male mice to fear a specific smell, cherry blossoms. Every time the mice smelled it, they got a mild electric shock. Soon, the mice would freeze in fear just from the smell alone. Here's where it gets crazy. The pups of these mice, who had never been shocked, also feared the cherry blossom smell. They were more sensitive to it, could detect it at lower concentrations, and showed fear responses when they encountered it. But the researchers didn't stop there. They looked at the mice's brains and found that both the trained fathers and their offspring had changes in the brain areas that process this specific smell. More neurons were dedicated to detecting cherry blossoms. And get this, the fear persisted into the third generation. The grandpups also feared the smell. The researchers even tried using in vitro fertilization to rule out any behavioral transmission from the parents. Same result. The fear was literally being passed through the sperm. Actually, one researcher told me this study made him completely rethink his understanding of inheritance. He said it was like discovering that Lamarck wasn't entirely wrong after all. Acquired characteristics can be inherited, just not in the way we thought. The Overcalyx study, 3 generations of data. Let me tell you about a tiny parish in northern Sweden that accidentally became one of the most important places in genetics research. Overcalyx sits way up near the Arctic Circle, and for centuries, it was incredibly isolated. The harvests there swung wildly. One year, feast, the next, famine. And the local church kept meticulous records of births, deaths, and harvests going back to the 1800s. A researcher named Lars Olivegren decided to dig into these records. He wanted to know, did the availability of food during critical periods affect not just the people who experienced it, but their descendants? What he found was absolutely wild. Boys who experienced abundance, who overate during their slow growth period right before puberty, had grandsons who died an average of 6 years earlier. 6 years. The excess food availability during that specific window somehow affected the health of grandchildren who wouldn't be born for decades. But here's the really specific part. This effect only passed through the male line. Paternal grandfathers affected grandsons, and the timing was crucial. Only overnutrition during the slow growth period, around ages 9 to 12, had this effect. A few years earlier or later, no impact. The grandsons died earlier from diabetes and heart disease. Basically, grandpa's feast became the grandson's health crisis. Meanwhile, if the grandfather experienced famine during that same period, his grandsons actually lived longer. It's like the scarcity prepared future generations for hardship. On the female side, things were different, but equally fascinating. If a grandmother experienced famine while she was in the womb, her granddaughters had increased mortality. But only the female descendants were affected. Think about that for a second. The food your grandfather ate when he was 10 might influence how long you live. That burger and fries isn't just affecting you. It might echo through generations. Stress in modern times. Now, you might be thinking this is all about historical trauma, famines, wars, things that don't happen much in developed countries anymore. But modern research shows that contemporary stressors have similar effects. Take 9/11. Researchers studied pregnant women who were in or near the World Trade Center during the attacks. Women who developed PTSD had babies with lower cortisol levels. Cortisol helps us handle stress, so these babies were essentially born with altered stress response systems. But wait, it mattered when during pregnancy, the mothers experienced the trauma. Third trimester exposure had the strongest effect. The timing thing keeps coming up, doesn't it? There seem to be these critical windows when we're especially vulnerable to epigenetic changes. Or consider this study from 2020. Researchers looked at people whose mothers experienced stress during pregnancy. Things like job loss, divorce, or death of a loved one. These individuals, now adults, showed differences in DNA methylation patterns. They were also more likely to have depression and anxiety disorders. Actually, I should mention something here. Not all stress is equal in epigenetic terms. Chronic, severe stress seems to leave deeper marks than acute, short-term stress. A bad day at work probably isn't reprogramming your grandkids' genes. But living in poverty, experiencing discrimination, or enduring an abusive relationship, that's different. The racist legacy in our genes. This brings up something uncomfortable but important. Some researchers are now studying whether the trauma of slavery and systemic racism could have epigenetic effects that persist in African American communities today. Dr. Janice Keikolt-Glaser at Ohio State University studies inflammation markers in different populations. She's found that African Americans often show higher levels of inflammatory markers, even after accounting for socioeconomic factors. Some researchers think this could partly be an epigenetic legacy of historical trauma. I remember talking to a colleague about this, and she pointed out how this completely reframes conversations about health disparities. It's not just about current conditions, though those obviously matter enormously. It's also about how centuries of trauma might have left molecular scars that get passed down. One study looked at DNA methylation in genes related to stress response in African Americans. They found patterns consistent with chronic stress exposure, and these patterns were associated with higher rates of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. The researchers carefully noted they couldn't prove these were inherited changes versus responses to current life stress. But the possibility is there. Breaking the cycle, can we reverse epigenetic changes? Here's something hopeful. Unlike genetic mutations, epigenetic changes aren't permanent. They can potentially be reversed. And this is where things get really interesting for treatment and prevention. Exercise, for instance, can change DNA methylation patterns. One study had sedentary people do a 6-month exercise program. By the end, over 7,000 genes showed altered methylation patterns. Many of these were genes involved in metabolism and inflammation. Diet matters too. Remember those Dutch hunger winter babies with altered IGF-2 methylation? Well, researchers have found that certain nutrients can affect methylation. Folate, vitamin B12, choline. These are all involved in adding or removing those methyl tags. Actually, let me correct myself. It's not quite as simple as just taking vitamins. The relationship between diet and epigenetics is complex. Too much of certain nutrients can be as problematic as too little. It's about balance and probably about timing too. Meditation and stress reduction show promise. One study found that experienced meditators had different methylation patterns in genes related to inflammation compared to non-meditators. Even more interesting, they found changes after just one day of intensive meditation practice in beginners. But here's what really gets me excited. Some researchers are working on drugs that target specific epigenetic modifications. These are called epidrugs, and some are already being used for certain cancers. The idea that we might one day be able to chemically erase the molecular scars of trauma, that's pretty amazing. The pregnancy window, a critical period. If you're pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant, this next part is especially relevant. The prenatal period is when many epigenetic patterns get established, and maternal experiences during this time can have lasting effects. Stress during pregnancy doesn't just affect the baby, it can affect the baby's future children. When a female fetus develops, her eggs are also forming. So when a pregnant woman experiences severe stress, 3 generations are potentially affected: herself, her baby, and her future grandchildren if that baby is female. This is called the 3-generation rule in epigenetics. Some researchers think this might explain why it often takes 3 generations for immigrant families to fully recover from the health effects of migration trauma. One study followed children whose mothers experienced the 1998 Quebec ice storm while pregnant. This natural disaster left people without power for up to 45 days in the middle of winter. The children exposed to this prenatal stress showed differences in DNA methylation that correlated with their mother's stress levels. Higher maternal stress equaled more methylation changes. By age 13, these kids had different body compositions, immune responses, and cognitive patterns compared to unexposed children. The researchers could literally predict some of these outcomes based on the methylation patterns they found in blood samples. The father factor. For a long time, people focused on maternal effects. Makes sense, right? The baby develops inside the mother. But recent research shows fathers contribute more than just DNA. Men who smoke before conceiving have children with increased risk of asthma and obesity. Men who start smoking before puberty have children with even higher risks. And get this, the effect is stronger in their sons than daughters. Alcohol use in fathers also leaves marks. Male mice exposed to alcohol have offspring with altered brain development and behavior. The pups show differences in genes related to brain development, and these changes persist even if the pups never touch alcohol themselves. Age matters too. Older fathers have children with different methylation patterns than younger fathers. Some researchers think this might partly explain why children of older fathers have higher rates of autism and schizophrenia. There's even evidence that a father's diet around the time of conception affects offspring. Male mice fed a high-fat diet have daughters with altered glucose metabolism. The effect passes through changes in sperm RNA. I find this personally fascinating because it means men's health choices before conception matter way more than we realized. That beer belly might not just be your problem. Social experiences and epigenetics. It's not just physical traumas like famine or chemical exposures like smoking that leave epigenetic marks. Social experiences do too. Children who experience abuse show changes in methylation of genes involved in stress response. One study found that adults who experienced childhood abuse had increased methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene. This gene helps regulate stress hormones. An increased methylation basically turns down its volume. The result? A hair-trigger stress response that lasts into adulthood. Even perceived social status affects our epigenomes. Research on rhesus monkeys, whose social hierarchies are similar to humans, found that low-ranking individuals had different methylation patterns than high-ranking ones. When researchers experimentally changed the monkeys' ranks, their methylation patterns shifted too. Poverty leaves marks as well. Children from low socioeconomic backgrounds show accelerated epigenetic aging. Their cells look older than their chronological age. By adolescence, these kids might be biologically years older than their wealthy peers. Actually, this might explain something that's puzzled public health researchers for years. Why do health disparities persist even when people escape poverty? If poverty leaves lasting epigenetic marks, improving someone's current circumstances might not be enough to fully reverse the damage. The obesity epidemic. More than just lifestyle? So here's something that might make you rethink the obesity epidemic. What if it's not just about supersized meals and sedentary lifestyles? What if part of it is actually an echo of our grandparents' experiences? Scientists studying the children and grandchildren of Dutch hunger winter survivors found something unexpected. These descendants didn't just have different body sizes, they had fundamentally altered metabolisms. Their bodies were essentially programmed to store fat more efficiently. In times of plenty, this becomes a liability. Makes sense, doesn't it? If your grandmother starved, your body might be calibrated to expect scarcity. Every calorie becomes precious. Your metabolism slows down. Fat storage ramps up. Your body is preparing for a famine that never comes. One researcher described it to me like this. Imagine your thermostat gets set while you're in the womb. If your mother is experiencing nutritional stress, your metabolic thermostat gets set to conservation mode. 40 years later, you're living in a world of abundant food, but your body is still operating like resources are scarce. This could partly explain why certain populations have higher obesity rates. Groups that experienced recent famines or food insecurity might carry epigenetic marks that predispose them to weight gain. The Pima Indians, for example, have extremely high rates of diabetes and obesity. They also experienced severe food scarcity in the recent past. Coincidence? Maybe not. But wait, there's a twist. Remember those overcalyx grandfathers who overate? Their grandsons had higher rates of diabetes. So both feast and famine can program future generations for metabolic problems. It's like our bodies expect the nutritional environment to stay relatively stable across generations. When it doesn't, problems arise. Mental health through an epigenetic lens. This research is completely changing how we think about mental illness. Depression and anxiety running in families isn't just about inheriting bad genes or learning unhealthy patterns. It might also be about inheriting the molecular scars of ancestral trauma. I mentioned the Holocaust studies earlier, but there's more. Researchers have also studied descendants of the Tutsi genocide survivors in Rwanda, the Armenian genocide, the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. In each case, they find similar patterns, altered stress response genes in the descendants of survivors. One study that really stuck with me looked at suicide risk. Researchers examined brain tissue from people who died by suicide. Those who had experienced childhood abuse showed different methylation patterns in genes related to stress response compared to those who hadn't. The abuse had literally changed how their genes were regulated in their brains. This has huge implications for treatment. Right now, we treat depression and anxiety mostly the same way regardless of family history. But what if people whose depression stems from inherited trauma need different treatments than those whose depression arose from current life circumstances? Some psychiatrists are already using this information. Dr. Yehuda, who did the Holocaust research, now screens patients for ancestral trauma. She says it helps her understand why some patients don't respond to standard treatments. Their biology has been shaped by experiences they never lived through. The legal and ethical minefield. Okay, so this is where things get complicated. If experiences can alter our genes in heritable ways, who's responsible for the damage? Could you sue a company for epigenetic changes caused by pollution that affected your grandparents? Should people be compensated for the inherited effects of historical injustices? These aren't hypothetical questions. Lawsuits are already being filed. In 2015, residents of Flint, Michigan didn't just sue for the immediate health effects of lead-contaminated water. They also claimed epigenetic damage that could affect future generations. Think about the implications. If a chemical company pollutes a town's water supply, they might be liable not just for current health problems, but for health issues in generations not yet born. The legal system isn't remotely prepared for this. There are ethical issues too. Should people be told about inherited epigenetic risks? Would you want to know that your grandmother's trauma increased your risk for depression? Some people say yes, knowledge is power. Others worry it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And here's an uncomfortable question. Could epigenetic information be used for discrimination? If insurers knew your grandparents survived a famine, could they charge you higher premiums for metabolic disorders? Could employers discriminate based on ancestral trauma? Actually, I think we need to be really careful here. The last thing we want is for this science to be used to reinforce prejudices or deny people opportunities. We need legal protections before this information becomes widely available. Positive inheritance, it's not all bad news. Hey, I realize this has been pretty heavy so far. Trauma, disease, inherited damage. But here's something important. Positive experiences also create heritable changes. Enriched environments in animals lead to epigenetic changes that enhance learning and memory in offspring. Mice raised in cages with toys, exercise wheels, and social interaction have pups with better cognitive abilities and stress resilience. In humans, there's emerging evidence that positive experiences like secure attachment in childhood, education, and even cultural practices like meditation might create beneficial epigenetic changes. Some researchers are studying whether resilience itself might be partly epigenetic. One fascinating study looked at the children of mothers who did yoga during pregnancy. These kids showed differences in genes related to stress response, but in a good way. They seemed to have more balanced stress systems. Exercise is particularly interesting. When mice exercise before mating, their offspring have better metabolic health. The effect passes through changes in sperm. So that morning jog might benefit your future kids in ways we're just beginning to understand. There's even evidence that learning can be inherited. Not specific knowledge, obviously, but the capacity for learning. Mice trained on cognitive tasks have offspring that learn faster. The mechanism? You guessed it, epigenetic changes in the brain. The environmental justice connection. This research adds a whole new dimension to environmental justice. Communities exposed to pollution, stress, and poverty aren't just suffering immediate effects. They're potentially passing on molecular disadvantages to future generations. Consider this. African American communities are disproportionately located near toxic waste sites. Hispanic agricultural workers are exposed to pesticides. Native American reservations often lack clean water. These exposures could be creating inherited health disparities that persist even if conditions improve. One study found that people living near highways have different methylation patterns than those in less polluted areas. The changes were in genes related to inflammation and cardiovascular disease. And some of these changes appeared to be heritable. I was talking to an environmental activist about this, and she said it completely changed her perspective. Fighting pollution isn't just about current health. It's about preventing generational damage. Every toxic exposure potentially echoes through time. Climate change adds another layer. Increased temperatures, natural disasters, food insecurity, all of these could trigger epigenetic changes. We might be creating a generation whose biology is shaped by climate trauma. Some researchers call this climate change in our genes. What you can do right now. So after all this, you're probably wondering, what can I actually do with this information? Here's the practical stuff. First, if you're planning to have kids, both parents' health matters. Not just during pregnancy, but before conception. Eating well, exercising, managing stress. These aren't just good for you. They're investments in your future children's biology. Really, for men especially, this is new information. That 3-month period before conception when sperm are developing, that's a critical window. Your lifestyle during that time could affect your kid's health. If you're pregnant, stress management is crucial. I know, easier said than done. But meditation, yoga, social support, these things might literally be programming your baby's genes. Some hospitals now offer prenatal stress reduction programs specifically because of this research. Diet matters, but it's not just about eating healthy. It's about getting specific nutrients that support healthy methylation. Folate, B vitamins, omega-3s. However, don't go overboard with supplements. Too much can be as problematic as too little. If you have a family history of trauma, consider therapy. Some therapists now specialize in intergenerational trauma. They can help you understand how ancestral experiences might be affecting your current health and behavior. Exercise seems to be one of the most powerful ways to positively influence your epigenome. It can even partially reverse some inherited patterns. 30 minutes of moderate exercise most days isn't just good advice. It might be reprogramming your genes. The future of epigenetic medicine. We're on the brink of a medical revolution. Imagine going to the doctor and getting not just your genetic profile, but your epigenetic one. A map of all those molecular sticky notes showing which genes are turned on or off. This is already starting to happen. Some companies offer epigenetic age tests that tell you how old your cells really are. Cancer treatment increasingly uses epigenetic drugs. Psychiatrists are beginning to consider epigenetic factors in treatment planning. In the future, we might be able to erase the molecular scars of trauma with targeted treatments, or prevent inherited metabolic problems before they manifest, or optimize our children's epigenomes before they're even conceived. But honestly, the most important revelation might be how connected we all are across time. Your grandmother's experiences live on in your cells. Your choices today ripple forward to affect grandchildren you might never meet. One researcher put it beautifully. We're not just individuals. We're part of a biological conversation between generations. Wrapping up, the science of epigenetics is rewriting our understanding of inheritance, health, and even identity. Those old arguments about nature versus nurture, they're missing the point. Our experiences become part of our nature, written in molecular marks on our genes. This knowledge is both empowering and humbling. Empowering because many of these changes are reversible. We're not doomed by our grandparents' traumas. Humbling because our choices affect not just us, but potentially generations to come. The trauma your grandmother experienced, the stress your father endured, the choices you make today, they're all part of an ongoing biological story. And while we can't change the past, understanding how it lives on in our cells gives us the power to influence the future. Next time you make a healthy choice, going for a walk, choosing the salad, taking a deep breath instead of stressing out, remember, you're not just taking care of yourself. You might be taking care of people who haven't even been born yet. That's the real message of epigenetics. We're all connected across time in ways we're only beginning to understand. And that connection, it's written right there in our genes.